Okay, we'll start with this. Our mutual friend JJ McCullough made me aware of your work, and I would describe you as a more informed and less deranged critic of Israel than I am. And the first question I want to ask you is very broad, which is why should Americans who care about politics, generally, specifically care about the issue of Israel at all?
It's very simple. We're paying for it. We're paying for it. Everything that Israel does is on us, quite fundamentally. And I would also argue that the amount of support that we do give Israel at this point, the blank check that we have given them, very clearly over decades, but most extremely over the past 19 months, has actually made them worse, has given them an excuse to be more savage. So even if you're interested in Israel, the project, the best interests of Israel, the current blank check that the United States provides is bad for Israel, it's bad for the United States, and obviously it is horrifically bad for the Palestinians, and something that is getting less attention because what's happening to Palestinians is so egregious. But what it's doing to the entire region, the entire Middle East, Arab world, what have you, is held hostage to the most aggressive elements of Israeli politics, held hostage to US weapons companies. I think that's mostly why this situation persists, but it's an incredible waste of US resources. It is making the United States dramatically weaker. And the moral sense, the base, I deeply, despite spending a decade getting more and more knowledgeable about awful things that the United States has done, I deeply still want to believe, and I do believe, that at least on the level of the US public, we want to be the good guys. And that's not, I've spent a decade looking at horrible stuff that the United States does and still being like, no, I'm still an advocate for US empire. This is still the best thing on offer. This is still the best that we can do. But the past 19 months have been deeply, deeply challenging to me. Mm. And there's been periods of time where I'm just I can't make the case anymore because it's just so delegitimizing. Yeah.
No, you said it was money. It's our money. That's why we should care about it. How much money is it? It's not that significant at the end of the day, right? This is what I'm told. It's it's a few $1 billion. It's not going to affect whether or not we have universal health care or something like that. This is just an excuse for people to criticize Israel because we give aid to, the one Jewish state and not, even though we give aid to all kinds of countries.
I think that's a defensible argument. I do agree that it's a rounding error, like $1 billion, what's the classic line, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, sooner or later you're going to get to real money. Absolutely, it's not the most expensive thing that the United States does. My understanding is that before October 7th, it was to the tune of $3 billion a year. It is worth pointing out, though, that it's $3 billion a year. And then the number two, which makes Israel the largest recipient of foreign aid. With most of these questions, there's different ways to calculate things. You can sort of get around stuff. There's no real getting around. Israel is number one in terms of US aid, military and otherwise. And I believe number two, of course, Ukraine changes that calculus since 2022. Egypt is number two. And the only reason Egypt is number two is to bribe them to let Israel continue to do what it wants. So, it's $1 billion here, $1 billion there. And then you add the extraordinary military costs. So it's, Israel specifically, the checks that we write to them to hand back to US weapons manufacturers are about $3 billion, but a more significant proportion than I really ever liked to look at of the $1 trillion we're about to be wasting on the Pentagon every year is Israel-related stuff. It's not all Israel-related stuff. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states sort of serve kind of the same purpose, sort of just making messes that we can bomb. But it's a lot of Israel. So it's a tremendous waste of our money, far beyond the mere $3 billion that we hand to them every year.
Do you think you said it delegitimizes the U.S. empire? I'm very critical of the U.S. empire, conceptually. I want the U.S. to be the strongest military power in the world, no doubt, but it doesn't need to be. We don't need to spend more than the next 7 countries. Maybe we spend more than the next 3 or 4 and remain in charge. But it would seem to me if I'm just doing, go ahead.
Sorry, just to that point, the extent to which the Yemen issue in particular, which we're only in to the extent that we're in because of Israel, is completely undermining the perception of U.S. military power, is another aspect of this. And Trump, wisely, I'm not a natural Trump fan, but Trump very wisely, over the past couple of weeks, has decided, yeah, we're not going to do this Yemen thing anymore because it's demonstrating that actually this U.S. military, this awesome U.S. military force isn't even capable of pushing around one of the poorest countries on the planet anymore. And like the use, and that's sort of it, that's an interesting thing when you talk about preserving U.S. power, preserving the idea that the United States is just the baddest guys out there you got to be intimidated by. The past couple of years have been really, really bad. I mean, from not being able to make enough artillery rounds for Ukraine to, the Yemen stuff, like Biden had already like demonstrated that the US Navy was useless against the Houthis, and the Trump administration like doubled down and just like made it even more extreme.
How is that the case? How are the Houthis outclassing or at least surviving?
So there's
what is the military logistics of that?
There's a basic lie about the Houthis that has been endorsed and sort of regurgitated everywhere, which is the idea that the Houthis are a militia. Like they're most often compared to Hezbollah or some other, the militias in Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces, that sort of thing. They're the government of Yemen. They've been the government of Yemen for a decade. It's very easy to obscure because if you look at a map of Yemen, you're like, oh, the Houthis are just in like the north and the north and the west there, which is the place in Yemen where everybody lives.
Right.
So the internationally recognized government controls Aden, which is a very serious city. I think it's the number 2 city in Yemen. And that's really about it. It's like Aden, a few desert oases and ports. That's everything that the internationally recognized government that the Saudis and the UAE have been trying to sell us for the past decade. That's all they control, and they're utterly useless. And I knew this. I put out a podcast, that Signal chat where the planning of the Trump administration was revealed. And I did a whole hour-long podcast. Like, this is a joke. Like, these guys just like have no idea what they're getting into. And thankfully, there was somebody in the Oval Office, it seems really just Donald Trump, who wasn't in this bubble of stupidity around U.S. military power. I mean, you look at that Signal chat, everyone's talking about, secrets getting out. I'm like, I'm sorry, you learn more watching my podcast than you do at 25 years at the CIA. Like, because they don't know anything. They're talking about how in that Signal chat, they're talking about, we're going to charge the Europeans once we clear out the Red Sea. And it's just like, you haven't even been reading the public reporting. Like, it was clear that Biden had spent $1 billion exchanging 600 shots with the Houthi government of Yemen. And these guys are like, oh, well, we're going to spend $1 billion in a month. And this is one of the most extraordinary news articles, I think, of the year. And it's a throwaway line in a great New York Times article called, I think it's like, Why Trump Declared Victory Over the Houthis, is that the F-35, you're familiar with the F-35, the $2 trillion fighter jet.
Yep.
And despite the fact that it took forever to build, the fact that it almost never flies, the sort of standard thing they're saying is like, well, you don't understand. Sure. It's like a finicky, egg trap or whatever. Like but it's got these capabilities you wouldn't believe. The Chinese will never see them coming, and it's confidential stealth magic. And there's just this throwaway line in the New York Times piece, which is that Houthi air defenses almost shot down an F-35. So the poorest country in the Arab world, one of the poorest countries in the world, almost shot down the F-35. And this is supposed to help us defend Taiwan? Like, are you kidding me? And that's beyond the $3 billion that we recycle through Israel, for Boeing and Lockheed every year. The basically demonstrating to protect a genocide that like the emperor has no clothes. And that's what we just did in Yemen. Like we're not going to talk about that much in US media, but like in China, in Iran, in, Russia, they're all like, wow, like the US Navy is even more useless. The US Air Force is even more useless than folks have been saying in the fever swamps. Like it's that's a cost of Israel.
So I want to talk about Trump's policy right now. Like you said, he negotiated the ceasefire with the Houthis, correct me if I'm wrong, allowed the Houthis to continue to strike Israel. It wasn't part of the peace with the United States that they had to stop striking Israel, which is interesting. It speaks to the degree to which perhaps Israel does not dominate U.S. foreign policy, as I have previously talked about. But to the broader point, I'm just curious on your thoughts on the Trump strategy, or at least whatever this new American strategy is, where, if I'm just thinking about it practically, it's like there's 2 billion Muslims in the world. There's 15 million Jews. There's one Jewish state. There's 2 billion Muslim. And there's all these, 40 Muslim states or whatever. It would seem to me that from a national security interest, just looking at the numbers, it's very important to normalize relations with the Muslim world, who historically has been our primary adversary. And like Trump's...
historically has been our primary adversary.
Sorry, excuse me. Historically, the U.S. Military has made them our primary adversary, whether it's justified or not, in the last 20, 30 years.
Different point, but I don't want to split hairs here.
Go ahead.
Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, a little less. I mean, these are all...
Sorry, I'm referring to the Middle East. Yes, correct. I should say the Arab Middle East. Yes. That's it. Yes, important clarification. But Trump's meeting in Riyadh, which Israel was noticeably not in attendance, right? Or at least not in any significant, not having any significant influence in that meeting. What do you think about the idea that, well, maybe the correct strategy is, instead of writing Israel blank check, saying, well, they're the only democracy in the Middle East, and and in the case of certain Mike Huckabee type figures, that they're, a religious nation, we have a moral obligation to defend them and all that. Moving away from that and moving towards a normalizing relations more with Saudi Arabia and its surrounding Arab neighbors. What do you think? Is that a good strategy? What do you think the consequences are of that?
The problem is that the Middle East is such a burning wreckage at this point. And even the folks like we are in charge, we own the Middle East, and Israel is not a particularly useful or effective ally on any level anymore. It was in the context of the Cold War, where a lot of these surrounding countries were newly independent and therefore more likely to gravitate towards the Soviet Union. Israel was very useful for us. And honestly, during the Cold War, the initial Nakba and nasty things that Israel done don't even make it into the top 10 of Cold War nastiness that we were sponsoring. It's in the context of today where they really are the worst thing happening. And the real nasty things that have happened in the broader Middle East region over the past decade, really since the Arab Spring in 2011, have all been our Gulf client states. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which are, I think, being pitched as these lovely, alternative, look at these great Arab successes. Trump had a speech in, I believe, Saudi Arabia, where he said a lot of things that were very exciting to hear, very great, talking about neocons are bad and the nation builders failed, and stuff that was great, that sent a lot of people in Washington, D.C. into conniption fits. Really great to see and hear. Unfortunately, he's also falling into the same dynamic with the Gulf states, which is they do horrible things in the region. We focus a lot on how, of course, Saudi Arabia, they cut a lot of people's heads off. That's terrible. But also just regionally, it does seem with MBS, they have finally, 15 years after 9/11 in 2016, 2017 or so, they have finally stopped being the main funder of Islamic terrorism worldwide. And then, of course, the Obama administration came in and picked up the ball for Syria.
Sure, right.
But they're still all about crushing any potential democracy in the Arab world. This is the affinity between the Gulf and Israel. Before the full-on balls-out genocide after October 7th, the Gulf monarchies were all getting as close to Israel as they possibly could. And they still are. I mean, to some extent, like this big show that happened with Trump in Saudi Arabia and the UAE yielded some very real, very positive results for Yemen and Syria. I would say effectively he kind of ended, it's possible, if he can pull it off, he's done more good for the Syrian people than like really any US president ever, just by lifting those sanctions. But for the people in Gaza, like it has been they've been written off completely. And the extent to which the Trump administration is making deals with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and it's seen as like this big affront to Israel, but only because the Saudis and the UAE aren't going the full, I mean, the UAE already sort of technically has, but Saudi Arabia won't do like the full like diplomatic relations with Israel thing again, because they can't actually physically do that and stay in power in the context of this genocide. But like the idea that there's some big difference, like there's an alternative between the Saudis and the UAE. The Saudis and the UAE are completely like US puppet states. And the idea that there's some kind of representative of the Arab people or like Arab strength is farcical. Saudi Arabia specifically is just built on sand, and the oil price is literally and figuratively. And the state of the oil price at this point means that like, and I think Trump's going to see this by the end of his term, that they're just not going to be able to bribe him to the extent that they have in the past. Like there were $600 billion of deals announced, and the UAE is going to put $1.5 trillion into the United States. And it's all nonsense. Like most everything that Saudi Arabia announces, about 10% of that will actually happen. Neom, the gleaming city that's going to rise. They're going to dig a big trench. And already like the big line building has gone from 100 miles long to 1 mile long.
Right.
And it's still just a trench in the ground. And yeah, it's all fever dreams and nonsense. Like as far as like what happened in the Arab world after the Arab Spring in 2011, which was this moment of incredible hope. I think it probably, a lot of people in the region want to blame Israel for what happened after that, but by far, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were much more responsible for that, because they are obviously existentially concerned in blocking the idea that Arabs can be democratic in any sense.
It seems to me it mirrors the mindset that people had with China, which is, well, we liberalize our economic ties with China, we liberalize the Chinese markets, and then they will change their culture accordingly to match democratic values or something like that. And that does not seem to have happened. And
that's something we never ever wanted in the Middle East.
Some people did, right? Some people wanted.
Nobody in Washington, D.C. We had the opportunity. I made a whole series of videos on this. The country of Tunisia, which is where the Arab Spring started, for a number of reasons. They, actually had one of the better sets of dictators, and then they kicked out his nasty successor. They had a full-on 10-year experiment in democracy. Arab democracy. I was excited about this. It could have potentially spread across the region. I believe that Algeria is also very fertile ground for this kind of thing. If it had been a success, its neighboring country, fully democratic for a full decade after the Arab Spring, had a constitution. People won the Nobel Peace Prize for putting together their constitution that was very democratic. They had peaceful transitions of power, and we gave them nothing. We actually fully funded the military, then ended up crushing that democracy in 2011. The idea that we want democracy in the Middle East is completely farcical. The reason we love Saudi Arabia is because it is so incredibly weak. There is no weaker model in the modern world than an absolute monarchy. Saudi Arabia has the most expensive, the third or fourth most expensive military on the planet, and it is useless because the Saudis saw in the 50s and 60s all the other kings, the king of Iraq, and later on the Shah of Iran got taken out. Well, I guess Iran wasn't the military. Got taken out by strong militaries. So the Saudis intentionally have a useless military. And that's the point. That's what we want on top of our oil. is we want the weakest and most debilitated person possible. That is the Saudi model that is, getting covers of The Economist every 3 years on like the magical future of the Middle East. It's quite farcical. We didn't want a liberal future for the Middle East because it arrived. It was here. And the most frustrating thing is like, we gave a few hundreds of millions of dollars to the Tunisian military that eventually worked. It was an autogolpe that worked within, should I wait for the second?
It's all good.
Yeah. That eventually worked with the,
okay, hold on. Yeah, that one.
The joys of New York City.
Nice. Which borough?
I'm in Manhattan, so I'm up in Harlem.
Okay, so yeah. Okay.
So it was an autogolpe. It was like the military did work with the Tunisian president that is now the Tunisian dictator, but we gave hundreds of millions of dollars to that military to beef that up. And as soon as like the dictator was in, all of a sudden the billions kept rolling in. Came rolling in from Europe, came rolling in from the United States. We are not interested in Arab democracy. We've actually actively
right against it. Well, and I mean, even if we were interested in it, it's not obvious that you can change a culture. I mean, you can't change a culture just because you have trade deals and you liberalize the economics of it, right? That's the issue in China, is we do have all this capitalist free trade, but they're as repressive as ever. And so
I would dispute that, but I think you're just making a point. We want to stick to the Middle East.
Sure. Well, okay, well, go ahead. Well,
China has not liberalized since the Cultural Revolution in Mao.
Well, okay. Yeah. Yes, sure. But they still are more, are they categorically different in terms of their authoritarian ethos versus 100%. Our? Okay, yes, that's what yes. I think a lot of they're not like America is what I mean.
Well, I think they're much more like America than they ever have been, and I think people getting in Washington D.C. like throwing a hissy fit because like a country of 1.4 billion like didn't change their system as quickly as like Singapore with 2 million people or like South Korea with 30 million people did, and like U.S. garrisons did. Like my thoughts on great power.
Fair.
Then would perhaps take us out of the scope of the
fair enough. I guess
you want. Suffice it to say, it's all an effing farce. It's all
sure. Yeah. And even just broadening out of just Israel, because it's the Middle East more broadly, and it does. The interesting development is Trump's. I think that summit in Riyadh marked a different shift. Like you said, there's a lot of things he said about neocons and all that. And one thing he said was, "We're not doing nation building. We're not going to tell other." This is a paraphrase. We're not going to tell other cultures how to do things, right? Like, and do you think that's the right model, or do you think we still? It's the U.S.'s responsibility to facilitate democracy. It's just we've done it so poorly. Like we've done it by,
in the Middle East, we haven't really done it. I think in the.
Do you think we have would you like in an ideal world, if you were head of the State Department or a president or whatnot, do you think it's just a matter of, well, we still should be encouraging democracy in the Middle East, we should just be doing it differently? Or is it just like, no, it's not our responsibility. If they want a monarchy and they want their cultures and their traditions to be the way they are, it's not our responsibility.
So they don't want a monarchy. Like there was a huge decade-long conflagration after the Arab Spring that was about how they didn't want monarchies. And we heavily funded and supported the monarchies in crushing it, not in their own countries. It's briefly in their own countries, but across the region, from Morocco down to Oman. Like we worked very hard. So if we want to preserve democracy in the Middle East, obviously the UAE and Saudi Arabia are not the partners.
Interesting.
Full withdrawal from the Middle East would be an extraordinary gift to the Middle East. The United States is 100% the hugest problem there, by far.
Interesting. Doesn't that pose a great deal of strategic threat to the United States in that, I think our largest military base is in Qatar. We have naval bases in the region. So it's like, but
oh no, the military threat to our military threat to our, it's sort of a circle. It's a very
the argument is shipping lanes, right? Like like the U.S. is the police of global trade and shipping lanes. So if we pull out of the Middle East,
our complete inability to do anything about that
with the Houthis.
Yeah, like so Trump's pitch on that is they're going to stop shooting U.S. naval U.S. naval ships, and then sort of yada yada that like, oh, and maybe they'll stop shooting the other stuff too. But there's no guarantee of that. Israel and Yemen are still in a shooting war. There's no insurer is going to allow a ship to go through the Red Sea. It's just not happening. So we failed utterly. The main thing to do to preserve shipping lanes is to not do wars around them. And there isn't a war around the Red Sea now, from Somalia to Sudan to the genocide in Gaza to Yemen, that the United States hasn't played a starring role in fomenting. So getting the U.S. base out of Qatar would be phenomenal for democracy in the region, would be phenomenal for the shipping lanes, the security of the shipping lanes. Israel, as horrified as I am by the genocide, I do believe there should still be an Israel. We can still protect Israel because the IDF, like the Kurds in Syria and Iraq, is an effective ground force. We can absolutely defend Israel's 1967 borders from Malta and Ramstein in Germany. And we don't need to be there. In fact, like, we weren't there for most of the Cold War. It's kind of an extraordinary thing. Like, the US massive military presence in the Middle East dates to the 1980s. Like, we just weren't there at all. And unsurprisingly, since we've been there in the 1980s, it has been a unrelenting story of horror for the whole region. These are not unconnected facts.
Yeah, I mean, it would actually be interesting. I would like to look at the data in terms of how much of, at least from the United States perspective, how much of our goods are imported from shipping that comes through the Red Sea, because the overwhelming majority of what we import comes from the West Coast directly from China, which is completely unthreatened by Houthi pirates or the like, right?
I mean, we still get a lot of stuff from Europe. We still get, we're trying to grow our relationship with India. I mean, I'm not saying we should just completely write off the Red Sea. I would love for Red Sea shipping to be stable. The most important thing to do for that would be to stop the genocide in Gaza.
Well, what do you say to, because this, to play devil's advocate, there are people who would say that, well, you have this view, you have this optimistic, naive view where, you know, the Arab, countries that we have had antagonistic relations with, one way or another, well, they, you know, you make the mistake that they think like you and I, and they're thinking about things from a strategic kind of point of view. It's like a lot of, like, Iran, for example, or, Iran being the principal actor, and all of its proxies, which include the Houthis, it's like they're Islamist. They hate our way of life as such, right? And given what we did to the Middle East, you know, in the past 3 decades, it's not surprising why. What do you think of the argument that, well, they say, well, we'll pull out? It's like, all we're going to do is allow the terrorists to come in and take over, and then even further put a stranglehold and empower the enemies of the United States.
It's been disproven over and over again. Nobody ever talks about Tunisia. Tunisia was a hotbed of Islamic radicalism. It's mostly because they were the richest of the Arab countries and had most people with wherewithal to go. But when the United States created the jihadi free-for-all that was the Syrian civil war, Tunisia proportionally sent the most folks to the Islamic State. However, when they were given the opportunity, when they were able to overthrow their US sponsored dictator, in 2011, they put together like a Nobel Peace Prize winning example of democracy with fully peaceful transitions of power. There were absolutely Muslim Brotherhood influenced folks in the political system there that contested elections and backed down when it was clear, even though they had Democratic majorities, backed down when it was clear that they had to preserve the democratic legitimacy of Tunisia. So I would argue that, in fact, like, do you remember how everybody talked about how Sunni and Shia were fated to hate each other and kill each other forever, and that was just the way of the world for thousands of years?
That's my current understanding. Iran and Saudi Arabia hate each other beyond all belief, right?
Oh, that's nonsense. I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, sure, everybody hates everybody's neighbors, but no, like there was this idea that it was this incontrovertible, forever, like, and it's complete BS, because Saudi Arabia for the past 6 years has been working very, very closely, has been working very, very hard for peace with Iran. The reason why Trump has a much better chance of getting a concrete deal between Iran and the United States over nuclear stuff that is lasting is because in 2015 with Obama and up until 2019, Trump tore up the first deal in 2018. The Saudis were pouring billions of dollars worldwide and tens of millions of dollars in Washington, D.C., specifically talking about how the Iran deal was evil, the Iranians were Nazis, the Iranians were Hitler, this, that, and the other thing. And essentially, there was a missile attack in 2019 that made it very clear to the Saudis that actually, if there was real U.S.-Iran war, Saudi Arabia would get wiped off the map. And they're like, oh, wait a second, no, this is a bad idea. And all of a sudden, like, the whole immortal Sunni Shia hatreds are gone. They're gone. Like they're walking across stages, shaking hands, in front of the Chinese foreign minister. Like they're trying to do business deals. The Saudis are actually like, well, can we somehow square the circle in this enrichment thing if we like share enrichment facilities? Like the Sunni Shia thing is over. And I don't want to minimize it entirely. Like
no, sure. I mean, Hamas is a Sunni. Hamas is a Sunni organization, right? And Iran is a Shia, sponsor. So clearly they can work together.
And they had a falling out over the Syrian civil war and then sort of patched things up. And like, I'm not saying these tensions don't exist, but there's this, in Washington, D.C., there's this very like, well, you got to understand, you can't possibly comprehend their savage mind. When like really at the end of the day, they just don't want their children to be blown up. Like, and I think that aspect of their savage minds, like I can grasp, we don't want our children blown up. And for the past 20 years, like the United States has unremittingly been blowing up their children. And now, but I don't want to like diminish what's been happening since October 7th, because like, this is like, I've spent a lot of time like being like, oh man, like this merciless bombing from the United States. I had no idea what merciless bombing was until the days, weeks, months after October 7th. Like what Israel's doing right now is on a completely different scale. And the idea that Donald Trump is somehow building long-lasting, secure relationships with the monarchs that crushed the possibility of democracy in the Middle East over the past decade, it doesn't appeal to me much. I think that most of the people, including probably some of the monarchs themselves, are seething at what is happening here. And yeah, they're trying to butter up Trump so he can stop stuff. My understanding is it's been emerging over the past couple of days that he had, in return for that U.S.-Israeli soldier that we had gotten returned, that Witkoff had promised Hamas that like, we'll get you a ceasefire, or we'll at least force Israel to start feeding you again. And instead they got Gideon's Butchers, or whatever the operation the Israelis are doing now, that is actually an even more dramatic stepping up of the onslaught on Gaza. So yeah, like this idea that like they hate us, they hate our freedoms is pretty farcical. It's just not. It's and I believed it. I believed it wholeheartedly. I was actually, I guess when I was about your age, I was a fanatical supporter of the Iraq War. I was like, yeah, and I was angry. I mean, it was like they obliterated my favorite lunch spot downtown. I was thirsty for blood, and they hated our freedoms, and they were savages. And so I get like some of the contortions that Israeli politics are going through right now. But like eventually I was like, I should probably start learning like what's actually going on in this region, like what's actually going on with these countries. Like that's like the origin story of me and my YouTube channel to some extent. And like the more I learn, it's just this is all nonsense. So
there's two other areas I want to cover. One, first off, is in a different podcast, you said, bringing it back to Israel, you said Israel represents the greatest threat to free speech in the United States in recent history, or something to that effect.
Oh, since Joe McCarthy, for sure.
Since the McCarthy era. Yeah. Why do you say that? And what do you worry about if people don't pay attention to Israel's pressure on the United States?
Well, so this has been building since long before October 7th, as part of the package of, there is actually an organization out there. I know he's a little mainstream, but John Oliver did a great bit on this, ALEC or what have you. There's an organization that puts out like form laws that with a very right-wing bent that just sort of get adopted across the country. And one of the things that are part of part of the standard Republican Party package is this law that it has to go through hoops. We still do have the First Amendment in this country. And most people in legislatures are still lawyers with some concept of it. But long before September 11th, they were basically saying, you have to support Israel to get a government contract in like Alabama or Louisiana. So this has been a long-term thing that only is possible if it's very down low and sort of sinister and insipid. It's to have a chilling effect, because if anybody challenges these laws, they instantly get evaporated, because again, we have the First Amendment in this country. But most people don't, most of the people targeted by these laws don't have the resource, and are just like, I'm just gonna quiet down. I'm just not gonna talk about the fact that Gaza's an open air prison. I'm not going to talk about, we talk a lot about the, I guess, was it about 700 civilians and maybe a couple hundred soldiers that were killed, Israelis that were killed on October 7th. In 2018, a similar number of entirely, I'm sure there were some Hamas militants among them, but, were slaughtered in Gaza, like October 7th plus, like in 2018, with 0 Israeli fatalities. And this is just, you're not allowed to talk about that. You're not allowed to think about that. You're not allowed to propose a boycott and do business with it's something like 25, 30 states in the United States.
Yeah, that's the craziest thing. The boycott laws. It's like at a state level, what are we doing? Why are states proposing these? It's like honestly, I think ultimately it is a really self-defeating approach from supporters of Israel. I call them Israel superfans, and they're idiots. Like it's not going to work. And in October 7th, post October 7th, that idiocy came out much fuller stream. And what's been done, again, our courts have freed, they still haven't managed with Mahmoud Khalil, but they have freed many of the high profile victims of Donald Trump's pro-Israel Gestapo. I'm speaking about there was a Columbia student, there was 2 Columbia students, a Tufts student, who were arrested for their speech. And it's like, oh, but they're residents, right?
They're residents, they're not citizens. And I'm like, that's not in the Constitution, buddy. That's just pure, that is pure, you don't understand America if you think that's okay. But it's being sold to us as okay to have masked security forces, like we live in Egypt or France or something, masked security forces bundling people into vans. That's supposedly okay. And thankfully we've had courts that have stopped that thus far, but it's an obscenity that, for Israel, honestly, that's kind of worse than McCarthyism. What happens with McCarthyism, what happens, say in Turkey, I lived in Turkey, and it's definitely a place that can be certainly recently where they've put the main opposition politician in jail, can be described as semi-authoritarian. They don't really bundle people into vans very much. I'm sorry. They bundle Kurds into vans a lot. That's a different story. But what they do is they just make you unemployable. And that's what McCarthyism was about. This whole thing with ICE running around with balaclavas and looking like hijackers, looking like terrorists, frankly, running around bundling people into vans. That is very new in American life. And honestly, it's kind of Donald Trump, using, as he tends to do, using Israel superfans like toilet paper, because Israel is going to get blamed for this, rather than, Donald Trump just kind of enjoys having a Gestapo and as having fun.
Right.
And it really likes the way he can use it. And it's not just Trump, it's sort of the conservative movement more broadly.
Yeah, it is certainly Trump trying to exercise control over universities that have been critical of him, and where a lot of the progressive kind of stuff comes from.
I'm sorry, I think I failed to answer your question about Trump in the Middle East. So
sure.
that Trump himself personally, it does seem to some degree, like Susie Wiles, Tulsi Gabbard, JD Vance, like there do seem to be individuals in the Trump administration that have recognized that we are wasting incredible amounts of money, prestige, and illustrating how useless our military weapon is in the Middle East. So they've pulled us out of Yemen. We are apparently going to allow the Syrians to attempt to rebuild for the first time by lifting these sanctions. These are great things, but that has come at the same time as a really horrifying escalation of what Israel believes it can get away with, that is endorsed by Trump. That AI generated, oh, look, it's going to be happy American Gaza. Like I think you can see the obvious contrast between that message and that we're not going to do nation building. Okay, so we're going to build like we're going to build like the 51st state. Like
it's disgusting. Yeah.
And I don't see that as particularly likely eventuality, though there are now U.S. contractors on the ground in Gaza. I think that's apparently the current Israeli government's aid distribution strategy. I'm not sure if that's actually going to come to fruition. I think it's insane, like almost everything there for the past 19 months. But what's infinitely worse is that, and what does make I still think that Biden is so much worse than Donald Trump, just for pure math. In whatever, the 15 months that Biden was president, he managed a single week of ceasefire. In the 4 or 5 months that Trump has been president, he's managed like almost 2 months of ceasefire. That makes him better on the Gaza issue than Biden, full stop. But what his rhetorical, like, we're going to clean out Gaza, we're going to do war crimes and build up a mini mall, it's going to be amazing. What that has allowed Israel, again, to its incredible long-term detriment, is going completely mask off now. It used to be you had to that's a member of the Knesset or someone who's saying something super genocide. That's actually not true. The head of the IDF was saying genocidal stuff in mid-October, mid-November.
Yeah, a lot of Israeli politicians say
yes, but
insane shit.
But now you've got the prime minister just being like, yeah, we're clearing it all out. Like we are clearing these people out. The kind of rhetoric that would seem extreme in Rwanda or Yugoslavia. I am tremendously grateful that we're not going to get a sunk aircraft carrier, because I think that's where we were trending with the Yemen thing. Was they just put enough missiles together and boom, we sink an aircraft carrier, and that is the true just evaporation of the idea of U.S. military edge anywhere. So I'm glad that didn't happen. I am so grateful. I still don't quite believe he's going to be able to pull it off. But if Trump can actually lift these serious sanctions, a lot of the worst of which are congressionally mandated, I'm tremendously grateful. But this is, and I predicted this. I said, obviously Kamala Harris isn't going to be great for Palestine, but she'll eventually get a ceasefire. Trump will eventually get a ceasefire. And what will happen after that ceasefire is tremendously important. Kamala will force the UN back in there. Kamala would have allowed them to rebuild, would have gotten food and medicine in there. And Trump was like, what do you want? I got a ceasefire, let them starve or move to Libya. So I am in a weird position where I'm very grateful this week to Trump administration actions on Yemen and Syria, but on the central issue, the genocide that we are bankrolling, that is on my head and your head and the heads of everybody watching this as U.S. taxpayers, that is rolling forward at a pitch that even the completely spineless Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who will easily delightedly hand out blowjobs to the entire Trump administration, has stood up and said, we're not going to accept this from Israel, and we're not going to give you a free trade agreement. We're considering sanctions. So. It's incredibly bleak. And I'm grateful, incredibly grateful to the Trump administration for getting us out of Yemen, for seeming like we might lift the Syria sanctions. The Gaza horror has not been ameliorated and might actually be accelerating.
The issue of Syria, maybe we can spend some time laying out the situation in Syria and how we got here and whatnot, because my understanding is, it was Bashar al-Assad was the what was he, secular allegedly? He wasn't an Islamist, right? He was the secular president in Syria, right?
I would think that, like, fundamentally, Assad was sectarian. So he's not from the main. He's not Sunni. He's not Shia. He's not Christian. I would think so. I think Alawites probably there's probably at least before the war there were probably fewer Alawites than Christians in Syria. Syria used to have a big Christian population before we launched this war on Assad. Sorry.
Well, so obviously Bashar got ousted, and in his replacement was a former Al Qaeda member, correct? Yep. Mm-hmm. That's the current president.
Yeah.
So what is the situation in Syria? Do you think that, is it a good thing that this new Syrian president is in charge? Is he genuinely reformed? Like, what's the relationship between Israel and Turkey? What is Turkey's interest in it? What is Israel's interest in it? What's like
that's easily another hour, but I'm happy to.
Sure. Well, maybe the 15 or 20 minute condense the key points.
So Ahmad al-Shara, which I am still training myself to say rather than al-Jilani, has been a very known quantity in the Syrian civil war for a decade. I was putting him in thumbnails like 8 years ago, and he is absolutely. He was in jail in Iraq. We had him in jail in Iraq, which is probably where he made more of the connections and became further radicalized. Does seem like he was sort of like a Syrian rich kid. Like I think his father might be a professor or something like that. He's like his brother's in the administration and just looks like sort of like, a bank manager or whatever. But yeah, he like went on jihad. And it's really one of the most extraordinary stories of the 21st century so far. I mean, like most likely to end at some point in the coming weeks and months, but I've counted this guy out before, and he's made it. I mean, it's true. 6 months ago, this guy had a $10 million bounty on his head from the U.S. government, and last week he was shaking hands with the U.S. president, who was saying, young, handsome guy, really getting
young, handsome guy. Yeah.
So I like a lot of my YouTube presence is being angry at Saudi Arabia. It was 2022 when the towers came down. Still take that very personally. Obviously, Saudi Arabia was the main actor behind 9/11. There's no question in that. Even like popular mainstream media, everyone's just sort of like, oh yeah, of course. And now that it was fun. I think Mike Pence was talking about that just this week, because Mike Pence is completely subservient to Israel, and this week Israel and Saudi Arabia seem to be somewhat at odds. Obviously they did 9/11. Like my most popular YouTube videos 5 years back are just taking Saudi Arabia to task. At a certain point, I've got to get over 9/11. At a certain point, I've got to get over. And even 5 years ago, looking at the horror that we had created in Syria, I was like, look, like, if there was one jihadist, like caliphate guy who was capable of taking over all of Syria, obviously that'd be preferable to Assad. But there isn't. There wasn't. There never was. We funded all these little jihadi elements that fought each other just as hard as they fought Assad. Even the suburbs of Damascus, there was, I think it was Ghouta. There was this famous big pocket, in the capital city. They could have really taken over, but the two militias spent more time fighting each other than they did fighting Assad. And that's like been a huge dynamic throughout the Syrian civil war. Assad is I think made people very angry because he was very promising after a much more competently vicious father who ruled Syria from the 70s until about the turn of the century. I would say 2000, 2001 or so. Assad came to power. He was not supposed to be the guy who was the successor. His older brother had died. He was married to this very glamorous, he was an ophthalmologist, married to this glamorous British woman. And there was a lot of promise. And I frankly think he was very interested in doing large scale opening to the West. And basically being bribed out of power, which is, by the way, a strategy that has worked over and over and over again for authoritarians across Latin America, across Asia. All of our best allies in Asia were run by horrifically murderous dictators. many of whom make Assad look like a milk toast up until like the 1990s. Asian financial crisis, end of the Cold War, helped us clear out a bunch of those guys. That's how you get rid of a dictator. You bribe them out. But the United States isn't interested in solutions to problems since the end of the Cold War, because we've got this big military infrastructure we have to maintain. So we want problems. So we created huge problems. I don't want to try and people fall into this fallacy of being like, oh, Assad was virtuous and he was lovely. Look at his hot wife. No, it was a disgusting regime, and like a lot of
Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard claim that he was not as bad as people make him out to be.
I mean, I don't blame Tulsi Gabbard for that trip at all. I think that was, I think the horror that we had unleashed in Syria, and that I blame the U.S. government for the Syrian civil war vastly more than I.
Right. Is that Operation Sycamore?
Operation Timber Sycamore is what's been reported on, crucially.
Sure.
But that is the largest CIA program of the century. Much was made of like, oh, we did these bad train and equip programs, like we tried to get rebels to fight the Islamic State. What was going on before that, and was only reported on thanks to the New York Times, was $1 billion, much bigger than the train and equip programs that the DoD failed so miserably with the Syrian rebels. Really indiscriminately going out to jihadists who are fighting Assad, not fighting the Islamic State. And the extraordinary thing is that this is another good thing that Donald Trump did back in 2017. He cut off that stream of funding. And when that happened, all of a sudden the Islamic State evaporated. The Obama administration, the State Department, they're all, the CIA is like, no, you have to understand, we would never allow money to go to a terrorist of any kind. We would never let money go to the Islamic State. But it's a front line with 25 different groups there, and if you're giving weapons to like 24 of them, and you're not giving it to Giuliani, sorry, the guy who's now the president, you're not giving it to the Islamic State, but you're giving it to the other 23 groups, like people go between these groups. Yeah. And it turns out that really the Islamic State and Giuliani's group, the current president of Syria's group, were actually the only functional parts of this fighting force. So yeah, like, okay, you sent all the weapons to the guys who are like the Free Democratic, Happy Sunshine gang, and then they transferred their stuff to Islamic State. So when Trump cut off that funding, very quickly the Syrian civil war ended. Of course, the Russians played a role in that. Of course, Hezbollah played a role in that. The Kurds played a huge role in that. But once the U.S. funding for jihad was stopped by Trump, the Islamic State rather quickly
evaporated,
dried up and blew away.
So what is the situation now in terms of it is this new, the artist formerly known as al-Jilani or whatever, the president, he is in control of, I mean, most of Syria. Are there still like Bashar rebel groups or something, or what's the situation?
Bashar Assad was an Alawite, which is a particular version of Islam. I mean, Shia and Sunni would perhaps say it's not Islam, but it is a different bouquet of histories and ideologies or what have you. And that population is located more on the coast, the one coastal outlet, because France carved Lebanon out of Syria. Like the historic coastline of Syria is now limited to just this chunk of land that is mostly controlled by Alawites. And that's, there are, I don't know if you call them Assad remnants or just Alawite ethnic groups who are currently fighting an insurgency. There are elements in the Syrian government that are really horrifically bad folks who've been, I would use the term genociding Kurds on behalf of the Turkish government. And now they are fighting this real insurgency in Alawi territory, but they're like killing hundreds of civilians. It was one particularly bad week. It does seem like Shara may have clamped down on that a little bit, but so that's very shaky. But honestly, as somebody who has made dozens of videos on Syria, I was shocked in December the extent to which al-Shara Gilani was able to roll out and really take over most of the country. The main threat to a unified Syria at this point is actually Israel. This group that had fought Israel's big enemy Assad for well over a decade, took over very quickly. It was like, we want no problems with Israel. This is not something we're interested in. And the Israelis proceeded to destroy every military installation they could in Syria and continue to bomb, are continuing to destabilize southern Syria and take new territory in southern Syria. They're basically, I think they've kind of reached a natural limit in the Damascus suburbs. They don't want another West Bank or a Gaza yet. So their sort of control has made it about as far as the Damascus suburbs. And they are attempting to hold this territory. This is why they were so angry about Trump at least promising to lift the Syria sanctions, because that introduces the prospect, the mere possibility that al-Shara could be successful. Al-Shara has done a good job of, it's funny, like in December and January, his beard would get shorter with every picture, and his suits would get better and better tailored. And he's buttering up Trump, he's buttering up Macron, I'm almost 100% sure there are women in the government. There are he's one of his greatest battles is, and I think it's probably not being too friendly to him to point this out, I don't think he wanted those massacres in the Alawi areas. So one of his greatest challenges is somehow turning this collection of militants into a coherent government of Syria. And he's made so much more progress than I could have imagined possible. And if the sanctions really are lifted, he's got a chance. The problem is Israel wants to keep bombing and taking territory from Syria. There's a lot of other problems. Right. That's probably the main one at this point.
We're coming up in an hour, and I want to quick actually rapid fire you some questions on foreign policy analysts that I listen to. Mm-hmm. And I want your thoughts on them, in a, condensed to the degree they can be.
I'm not good at that, as we've proven.
That's fair. That's right. That's right. But I still want to hear. Mm-hmm. John Mearsheimer.
I like Mearsheimer a lot. I think that realism is a nice way to look at it. I don't really believe in realism. I'm not a realist because I think the realists are also fantasists. I don't think there's any natural reason why we should fight with China. That I disagree with Mearsheimer on. But I agree with him on Russia. I think he's got his head straight in the Middle East. Yeah.
Jeffrey Sachs.
I like a lot of what he's done. I can respect a guy who's trying to make up for his past errors. I think he's kind of the creative destruction guy in Eastern Europe and Russia, and I think he acknowledges to some extent that he's responsible for the mess that was created, and I think he's taken a different tack. Occasionally, I do think he goes a little too far in the other direction in protecting, like Assad, legitimately bad dude. We should not have launched a civil war against him. Like those 500,000 dead people, I think, are as much on the U.S. taxpayer as they are on Assad. But Assad's still a bad dude, and I think Jeffrey Sachs sometimes plays around with that a little more than I'd like.
Tucker Carlson.
I come from a deep-dyed hatred of Tucker Carlson. He's the bad guy at Fox News. Blah, 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 blah. But goddamn, man, and still, I'll tune into a Tucker Carlson thing, and he'll say something about immigration or women, or it's any of a broad array of things that I find absolutely appalling. Tucker Carlson is like effing magic on foreign policy, and apparently personally intervened in 2020 to keep the U.S. from going to war with Iran, and he is very publicly, along with other people, this is not a guy who has ever said a nice thing about Charlie Kirk or Steve Bannon before, but Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk are just we don't need another war in Iran.
That wing of the Republican Party is growing.
Some of the people with the biggest platforms who are saying that very sensible thing. I disagree with those gentlemen on really everything other than, we just don't need another $1 trillion war in the Middle East. And the fact that that's not the main thing we're thinking about when we look at Israel it blows my mind.
Yeah. Peter Zehian.
Zehian I like because he kind of is dismissive of China in ways that nobody else is. He's too dismissive of China. I think he gets a little too far up his own. He's very, very impressed with himself. He puts out an opinion on everything. The more I know about a topic, the dumber he sounds. He is useless on the Middle East. He is he's a takesmeister. I think it's for a while I was like, thank God somebody is pointing out that China's not as big a deal as they should. But I think now, like, too many people in policy spaces are taking that too much to heart and being like, oh yeah, like we can win in Taiwan. No, like we can't. There's no
certainly not stretched out with all these other wars.
Yeah.
Okay. And then last, what is your opinion of the famous foreign policy analyst Destiny?
I have not watched a lot of Destiny other than clips on his approach to Israel-Palestine, which I found pretty unifyingly appalling. I think he's like proudly says that he just started reading books a year ago or something, and like presumes to understand like this conflict and exclusively through like the lens of like what Joe Biden thinks. It's pretty nightmarish. I don't know much about Destiny other than he's really bad on Israel-Palestine. Oh, I did want to point out I have made some of my most successful videos in recent years have been Peter Zehian takedown videos. So just do a little plug for that.
Nice. Yeah. And then actually, what do you think? Norman Finkelstein. What do you think of Norman Finkelstein?
I tend to agree with him. I think I haven't really. It's interesting. I don't engage with his work so much. For a guy who makes videos, I'm a very visual, like reading kind of guy. And every time, when I'm uploading one of my shorts and a Norman Finkelstein clip comes up, I'm like, that guy seems to have his head on straight. Yeah,
that's fair. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for this. Well, absolutely. I will need to pick your brain again as events continue to develop in the future.
Happy to be here.
But yes, thank you.
You're very welcome.